welcome back to the Purple Cloud podcast. Today we have a very special guest and someone I've been wanting to interview for quite some time, Marta Hansen, Associate Professor of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. Part of the reason of me developing this podcast was to bridge the gap between scholarship and practice. So I'm always excited to interview well-known academics in the field of Chinese medicine in order to get their work more exposure, especially amongst practitioners in the field. Marta is perhaps best known for her work speaking of epidemics in Chinese medicine, which is in a large part an examination of the historical development and uses of Wenbing or warm disease theory. And we touch on how this work stands 10 years later in the interview. And we also have a very interesting discussion on its relationship to SARS and the current COVID pandemic. We also talk in quite a bit of depth about her idea of medical bilingualism, which I think will be of a lot of interest to any practitioners or historians out there. And we also talk about her current work on Chinese medicine and the hand. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Today, I'd like to welcome Marta Hansen to the program, to the Purple Cloud podcast. She is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins currently, soon to leave to hopefully greener pastures. I'd like to welcome Marta to the program today.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm so pleased to be here.
I'm very happy to have you here because part of the reason I started the podcast was to create more of a dialogue between scholarship in the profession and physicians in the profession, and have a bit more of a bridge between these sort of fields and disciplines. And I understand that it's kind of an interest of yours again with your work. Yeah, your work with many other sort of physicians and scholars in the field. And I'm just wondering how you see this relationship existing in its current state and how it's possibly developed a bit over the years.
Yeah, I like to think of myself as a bridge as well. So thank you for using that metaphor. My students have been clinicians initially, like Pierce Salguero started out working in medicine from Thailand in massage and herbal medicine, and James Flowers, who you know, also a clinician before he came to work with me, and currently Sarah Zanolini, who's trained as a clinician of Chinese medicine and now working on history. So in my training of graduate students, I really like to work with people who understand medicines, traditional medicine, whether it's traditional Thai medicine or Chinese medicine, on its own terms, and also have the language skills to read, classical Chinese and modern Chinese, et cetera. And then we can start to really do justice to the medical archive that's in Chinese to bring it to a broader audience.
Yeah, right. That's really interesting, and maybe you could let the audience know a little bit about how you personally ended up in this field and what your background is and what sort of attracted you to dive into the whole world of Chinese medicine.
Well, it wasn't because I was really sick with something and I couldn't and discover Chinese story. Medicine. Yeah,
that's kind of my story. So yeah.
Yeah, and often that is the story, right? Where the limitations of biomedicine often bring people to seek other modalities to help them with their problems. No, my story really begins, you could say, with the Vietnam War.
Okay.
Yeah. So my father was a physician and drafted into the Navy, and he was, deployed in Japan during the Vietnam War, and brought his young kids, wife, and my mother, and me at 3, I think, or 2.5, and my newly born brother at 6 weeks to Yokohama. So they were supposed to only stay 2 years, but they stayed 3 years there. My father was a physician dealing with the the casualties, et cetera, out of the Vietnam War context, and very much opposed to the war and a pacifist in many ways, but in that context was drafted into it, brought the family to war. And I was immersed actually in Japanese kindergarten school.
Oh, wow.
Because they moved off the base. They wanted to have an immersion experience in Japanese culture and really fell in love with that part of the world within the Japanese friends, etc. And so I brought that back with me because I was fluent as any 5-year-old would be in Japanese. Back with me to Minneapolis. My parents continued the relationship with Japan through the international organization or office at the University of Minnesota. And I didn't have a chance, though, to study, pick up that language at all in my, grade school, junior high, or high school. But I did have an opportunity to study Chinese in high school. So starting in 10th and 11th grade, I had Chinese language training in a public high school called Central High, and a very charismatic Chinese language teacher named Margaret Wong, who impressed upon many of us that we had to dedicate our lives to China in some way or another. Right. Not everybody picked up that baton, but many of us did, including myself. And my father was a physician. Actually, there's other medical dimensions in my family, so I grew up in that world. When I set myself the goal at that time in high school that I wanted to bring together Western medicine, which my family is part of, with Chinese medicine, because I had seen a film about acupuncture analgesia that came out of the whole Maoist medicine, revolutionary medicine context through in the 70s, through the organization U.S. People's Friendship Association that my Chinese teacher was part of. Now I see the same documentary as a form of propaganda.
Right.
Yeah, but at that time, I was really impressed and just thought I needed to be this bridge between the two worlds. And I found in the summer of my probably 11th grade, 10th or 11th grade, the opportunity to study acupuncture out of the living room of a woman named Edith Davis. And she had polio as a child and had learned acupuncture and was disabled in some ways, and learned acupuncture as very helpful to her health, and committed herself to learning it, and actually ended up becoming a major player in Minnesota for establishing a school of Oriental medicine, which now is the School of Chinese Acupuncture and Herbal Medicine as part of Northwest Health Science University here in the Twin Cities. So I had this summer class with her. We read Felix Mann's book on acupuncture, and at that time, I thought his scientific approach to acupuncture was really incomprehensible. Okay. And I just I couldn't wrap my head around what he was saying, and then how these people were practicing medicine who didn't know Chinese, but that was fine. But I wanted to, at that point, bridge this. I wanted to master Chinese language and learn, the medicine. So I went on to college to Brown University, where I studied Chinese and also classical Chinese, and pre-med courses. And it was in my senior year I had to choose between classical Chinese or organic chemistry, and I couldn't take both because they were both at the same time. And one class was hundreds of students where the main goal was to weed out people, and the other option, which was classical Chinese, was just me, because the other students that were interested in Chinese were taking modern literature, not classical Chinese. So it was me and a professor in, I think, applied math and physics, Korean professor who wanted to improve his classical Chinese, with David Lattimore, son of Owen Lattimore, who was a victim of McCarthy-era anti-China politics. But at any rate, I decided that I couldn't do both the sciences and the humanities. So I decided I had to make a decision at that point. So I decided to apply to graduate school to see if I could get in. I applied for a National Science Foundation grant, and I decided to apply to work with Nathan Sivan at the University of Pennsylvania in the History and Sociology of Science department. And I applied for a National Science Foundation fellowship to work with him. And it all came together. Like, I got accepted in the department, I got to work with him, and I got this fellowship for 3 years. And I never did go back to take organic chemistry and apply in medical school and et cetera. I took this path opened up, and so I took that path.
Right.
And I had no idea what I was getting myself into, to be honest with you. When I look back at it, I think, it looks like a straight path.
Sure.
Yeah, but I really had no idea what I was getting into. I wanted to look and examine the pharmaceutically effective medicinals in Chinese materia medica and bensal.
Right.
But that's not what I ended up doing, because I learned a lot of other things about what it means to do the history of science and how do I apply those methods and analytical ways of thinking to, what I learned was a really rich, incredibly complex archive on Chinese medicine.
So it kind of reminds me, you wrote an article on Tuyoyo a few years ago, and you used the term medical bilingualism. So from this story, it seems like this has been a running theme for a while with you.
You could say that as a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Maybe you could explain to the audience a little bit more about what you mean by this term.
Well, I have to say that term didn't really come to the fore until I found a place to use it in responding to Tuyoyo. But I had been thinking for a long time about, as you could say, starting at 16, when I had a sense of incomprehensibility. Like these are spheres that how do you become a bridge to understand these two very different approaches to the human body and health and disease, right? Maintaining health and treating disease. And in studying Chinese medicine and its history, and also really smart anthropologists about it, I was really interested in teaching to my students about how to understand Chinese medicine on its own terms as a completely logical system within itself, at the same time understanding that biomedicine is a system that also works in very powerful ways in and of itself, and that the two, however, are incommensurable. And what really fascinates me are people who actually move between one and the other frame. They're able to think in both ways of thinking. So I think the work of Volker Scheid, an anthropologist, captures this really well, and Eric Karchmer, that physicians who are trained in classical Chinese medicine also have to understand biomedicine, and they toggle. I use the word toggle between these two frames, and I'm a multilingual person, so I think that the metaphor of linguistic moving from one language to another, like languages are mutually incommensurable or incomprehensible, right? So I think that language is a really good metaphor for understanding how physicians, like at the bedside for COVID-19 in mainland China, or earlier for SARS, are treating patients with integrated treatments. They're thinking in both biomedical terms, and they're thinking in traditional Chinese medical terms when they give integrated treatments like herbal therapies along with antiviral drugs, or working in tandem with their biomedically trained physicians. And so this process that's within individuals, they've integrated these different ways of thinking. They move back and forth, I think is worth paying attention to. One, this is why I wrote the article on the case of TCM and SARS, but also it needs a term for people to understand what I'm trying to capture, or the phenomenon. And so I think medical bilingualism is a useful analytical concept to capture the phenomenon of people integrating within themselves the ways of thinking in two incommensurable frameworks. And you can't, they toggle back and forth, just like my experience going from English to French, or, to Chinese, or, not so easily with German, I'm finding. But yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've got a question about that with the toggling back and forth, because that's, in some people I find it, especially in practice, it operates, you're able to sort of use them both as standalone entities. In other cases, I noticed there's a sort of blurring between the two, and you could say, you've got, furthering your language metaphor, you have Chinese and English. There'll be a sort of a Chinglish where people will do a bit of both, like the guy you mentioned trying to do the acupuncture, but explaining it in Western medical terms.
That's a good observation. I would call that hybridization.
Okay. Yeah.
But I like Chinglish for Chinese and English.
Okay. Well, you've spent time in China. It's a real thing. But I'm curious, because when I find when it goes into that territory, I'm often a little bit wary. And I mean, it's happened in Chinese medicine history, and it can often be interesting, but I find it sometimes then you're not sort of often not taking the medicines on their own terms, and it's becoming sort of something else.
What I find useful is to think about the process of two different cultures, medical cultures, coming together as having two distinct possibilities, but on a spectrum, not on either or.
Right.
And what I mean by that spectrum is, one is contestation, differentiation, purification, like doubling down on your difference. And the other one is cooperation, hybridization, some kind of synthesis.
Right.
And we see in the Chinese medical engagement with biomedicine, and that's just one example I know really well, but you could say it with other kinds of complementary and alternative medicine or traditional healing practices in other parts of the world, like in Africa, where they're still very robust, that contestation or cooperation is a spectrum along which different incommensurable medical systems interact. And often we emphasize the contestation, differentiation, hardening of boundaries, the incommensurability side. But what I'm trying to talk about here is that you do have the differentiation and incommensurability, but there are people who are bilinguals.
Okay.
Who are toggling back and forth. And then what you're bringing up is another example, which I really appreciate in this discussion, which is on the cooperation, hybridization, effort to find synthesis that you're phrasing as Chinglish, but that there's some kind of translation that's not a one-to-one complete appropriation into biomedical terms, right? But there's some kind of acknowledging of each side and something new created, like a neologism.
Right. Yeah, there's
a synergy that you're gesturing to.
Yeah, and I think it's often very interesting and has its positives and negatives, but I think I'm noticing much more of that happening in practitioners in the West, especially as more people become literate with the older Chinese texts and still have one foot in that world and one foot in the biomedical world. You also mentioned briefly how it was a factor in SARS and is a factor in COVID, and that's something I also wanted to bring up because your book, which I have right here, the Speaking of Epidemics in Chinese Medicine, it's about 10 years old now, at least.
It's 10 years old, yeah.
Yeah. Towards the end of it, I think you dip your toes in that water in the SARS sort of thing, and you've been working a little bit in the COVID thing. First off, I'm wondering, how does this work exist in today's pandemic? I mean, I know it's a little bit different and it focuses a lot on the warm disease when being sort of thing, but I'm really curious to get your take on the current state of the pandemic, because I don't know anyone who really has who's really that well versed in the the history of epidemics in China as you?
Thanks for that question, Daniel. I really appreciate it, because I wrote that book as on the heuristic of a biography of a disease concept, and I focused on Wenbing, and realized when I was finishing it up that putting it together rather in 2000, 2003, I couldn't write the obituary because SARS was understood in the Chinese medical context as a type of Wenbing. Yeah. So Wenbing is a disease, and as is COVID. So the way I ended that book is on the issue of the persistence in the present of traditional Chinese disease concepts. And why does Wenbing persist into the present? And that's because it still not just has meaning in terms of how they understand and interpret the symptoms that patients were having, but it legitimated therapeutic interventions that were actually used in the hospitals in mainland China for SARS patients. They say upwards 52% at that time. And I wrote an article about a chapter in Health and Hygiene in Chinese East Asia about that, published in 2000. When was that published? 2010. But then in COVID-19, it's also a type of Wenbing, and even more patients were treated with integrated medicine for formulas coming out of the worm disease school, because that disease concept still holds power in organizing symptoms of patients to tailor different types of herbal and also acupuncture strategies for helping that patient get through it. Now, nobody or withstand this obvious novel coronavirus. So what I find so interesting is that the book is, it acknowledges that I can't write an obituary of the disease concept in the case of SARS, but it still lives and thrives today in COVID-19 because that disease concept legitimates therapeutic strategies that the clinicians, who I call medical bilinguals, who were brought in even more so for COVID than for SARS earlier. There's lots of differences between the two, but they legitimated therapeutic strategies that they thought helped their patients survive. And I'm going to just make a statement now. I think that that's a real tangible life or death advantage that the mainland Chinese have over any other countries in the world, that they do have herbal therapies, they do have acupuncture protocols that help deal with acute infectious diseases. Now, nobody is saying that they cure coronavirus, that they cure this or that type of virus, right? What they're saying is that they have therapeutic strategies that help the patient withstand the onslaught of these novel viruses. And I think that's really important to note.
Yeah. You touched upon similarities, but also some of the differences between the SARS and the COVID cases. Do you see it's these sort of trends which sort of started in SARS are a little more broadly expressed in the COVID pandemic, or there's some things which are very new about the COVID pandemic? I know you've touched on the idea of a reversal of the idea of the sick man of Asia and it being
sick Uncle Sam.
Yeah,
you read that article too?
Yeah, I heard you speak about it in a few months ago.
ISDAM webinar.
That was the one. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the existence of that ISDAM webinar, for one, makes this COVID pandemic really different from the SARS. In SARS, China wasn't as globally integrated in the world as it is today. So the disease did not spread as widely as it did today. It's different. Of course, biologically, the coronavirus for SARS is different from the coronavirus that we're experiencing today in different ways. But what I want to talk is more on the macro level. The spread of the disease was much more rapid, I think, because China was more globally interconnected and the world is more globally interconnected than it was before. And the other thing I want to say is the way China responded within China is really different in that they mobilized the traditional healer network in a way that they didn't as much during SARS. Like, they built upon that.
Yeah.
So that is really different. And the other thing that's really different is they also took great pride in their traditional medicine and the integrated approach, and were shipping, formulas to Italy and to Africa, which then had major pushback from different conservative media and other just general media, New York Times, The Economist, Breitbart, which is really right wing. And so in SARS, they weren't trying to actually, and they not just tried, they did ship Chinese formulas to other countries in the world to help them help with their patients to survive this disease. And that was considered to be a form of, it did not fall well in the Western press. And I think that marks this case as really different from SARS case, because people they weren't even, like, the newspapers weren't even acknowledging that integrative medicine was happening within the hospitals, much less the Chinese state broadcasting it globally.
Right.
And now we have a situation where everybody in the world knows that Chinese government was supporting traditional medicine for treating their patients in an integrated way. They are loud and clear about this in the world, and they're trying to send the what they consider to be the most effective formulas abroad. And in response, people are writing about what's happening right now on this topic in a way that nobody was writing about it in English. Everything I was filtering from the article that I wrote was in Chinese, right?
Yeah.
So even the fact that you went to a webinar where people were discussing these things makes this situation completely different from the SARS situation. And furthermore, in the United States, a lot of people are seeking Chinese medicine to help treat their COVID cases, and even Tibetan medicine community, which was featured in the webinar.
Yeah.
Tibetan medicine was involved too, in the absence of therapies that help patients withstand this kind of novel disease. Tibetan medicine, Chinese medicine, medicine in Mongolia have come in and played a significant role. And that phenomenon, just wasn't even being covered in 2002, 2003.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah. So at least there's a debate about it now.
Yes, there's a debate about it. It's people are making it visible. There's discussions in webinars. It's a much different media world than it was just 18, 19 years ago. Yeah. And I think that is very promising.
I think so too. I mean, I'm very happy more and more people are encountering it, and it's becoming, there's a dialogue around it now rather than it just being completely brushed away. One thing I did, I still hold on to the idea, because I had noticed when I was in China the last few years that even before all of this, there was more of a push in the training of doctors towards classical things. And I'd kind of sensed it accompanying a rise of nationalism and this kind of thing, and a move away from the wanting to sort of pair the zhongyi jiehe, the pairing together of Western medicine and Chinese medicine, which had been quite a strong paradigm. So I'm wondering if I still wonder if this isn't an extension and is some way connected with nationalism and in China. And I mean, even if it is, I still think it's doing a good thing in the West by becoming more available. I think that's and more accessible. But I'm wondering if there's not a propaganda element to it as well. Much like you mentioned in the 70s, the acupuncture for anesthetic, that kind of thing.
Acupuncture for acupuncture analgesia.
Analgesia, yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. I think cultural nationalism is absolutely at play, and we have to understand the complexity of that. And certainly the Chinese have been pushing that their authoritarian government has been more successful in controlling COVID-19 vis-a-vis the United States. And, I think that's a political move that I wouldn't support. Although, it is more...
It is more successful at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's more successful, but I don't think that legitimates their government. The fact is, they are more successful because they have full surveillance on their population, but that doesn't mean that they have a better government overall. And I think absolutely the push of their medicine around the world is also a form of cultural nationalism. I mean, the beginning of medical revivalism in 1930s China is a form of cultural nationalism. And part of the propaganda machine. I don't disagree with that at all. But I will still stand by my position. I think that they are better positioned to deal with new outbreaks like this when you have multiple modalities to help the patients survive. But I want to put on the two things on the table here. One is that none of these physicians who are medical bilinguals, as we've already explained, are arguing that they have a cure for it, that they are treating symptoms, etc., helping alleviate, reduce fevers, etc. The other thing that I want to say that it's important to understand is they're thinking in both frames. And I think that that's an advantage. And you can't just use the therapies without understanding the mindset behind it. Like, I would not advocate for just using, a Chinese lung therapy because you have a lung problem. You need to work with somebody who understands the whole way of thinking in order to make sure that that particular lung clearing formula or anti-inflammatory formula is appropriate for your constitution at this with the kind of manifestation or syndrome you're manifesting. So that's what I really want to get on the table. I don't think that you can just send out, certain types of formulas and say, okay, these are the signs to treat and this kind of patient. I think it is best applied when it's, you have people who are medical bilinguals who understand and are able to understand the individualized treatment protocols and how to adjust formulas for the specific patient based on what they're going through and the signs that they're manifesting for a case like COVID-19. I mean, the big thing about Chinese medicine, you have one name but different manifestations, and you have to adjust accordingly.
Yeah, sure. I still I've listened to a few of these seminars and I've been paying attention into how they've been treating it from a Chinese medical perspective in China. You've said it's seen as a wenbing. I've seen that, but there's still a lot of ideas floating about what is COVID in the Chinese medicine community. I think in that lecture series, in the I Asked Them a lecture series, they alluded to it, and a lot of different ways of looking at COVID from a Chinese medical perspective. I'm wondering if, because you in your book you talk a lot about the geography in the north and south, if you'd come across anything geographical to do with COVID, or its origination in certain areas and then it's now a global thing. So there's certainly a geographical thing there, and now with the mutations arising in certain areas, I'm just wondering if you come across anything to do with geography in the pandemic.
That's a great research question.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, yeah.
To be honest with you, I'm sure it's there. Because I found it and I wrote about that geographic imagination for SARS and how they explained it from the sources that I found then. And I just have to feign, that feign ignorance, but I just have to state that I haven't read that material yet, but that doesn't mean it's not there. I would predict that there are those kinds of arguments, because they do think of such outbreaks related to climatic configurations. But ultimately, it's not about the cause. Like when I look at the literature, fine, it's due to a coronavirus, but that's not going to change how they treat the patients. Right? It's like the etiology doesn't really matter. They can hold in their mind that vaccinations are good and the whole way that vaccinations operate, focusing on the specific, the level of the science we have now for vaccinations is incredible. And that makes COVID-19 really different from SARS. And people that I'm talking about who are medical bilinguals, which is if your listeners don't get anything else out of this talk but that term and how it helps clarify certain phenomenon I want to capture, they can hold that in their mind and say, well, but that doesn't, I have another way of thinking about this, how to treat this patient that's not based on etiology. It's based on the syndrome that they're manifesting at this time. And in that way, these newly emergent diseases of the 21st century are not new to them. Right? They're not new. They can treat acute infectious diseases with the kind of formulas they've developed in treating, let's say, influenza in 1918, treating other types of acute infectious diseases over the course of the 18th and 19th century when this new discourse on epidemics arose that I wrote about in my book. Yeah.
I guess it's another sort of extension of this same idea of medical bilingualism was your work, changing topic a little bit, but with Gianna Pomata, which I thought was fantastic. That's a few years ago now, isn't it? But it's very much looking into 17th century exchanges of knowledge between China and Europe, which I think a lot of people out there wouldn't really be aware of. And I guess it ties into the COVID thing a bit with you saying now this is a new, a huge amount of knowledge in Chinese medicine and debate about Chinese medicine is now sort of coming up in the West. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this history and the Jesuit involvement in all of this, because I thought it was fascinating, and a lot of people I didn't know much about it until I'd read this article. Right, and that's a 2017 article in ISIS, and yes, that's the one. Yeah.
We also have a new article that's come out in a book on translations at work.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that one.
Yeah, I'll share that with you. And also a third piece that's come out is a conversation between us and Elaine Liang, who's a historian of recipes in early modern Europe, and the History of Science Society newsletter published that exchange. So I'll share those two things with you after.
Oh, fantastic!
Afterwards.
Thank you.
You can make them available as well to your listeners if you have a means to do so. But basically, Jana we were colleagues together at Johns Hopkins in the History of Medicine department. She's an early modernist like me, but works in Europe and was writing about the history of medical cases. And I then said to her, well, the history of medical case records in China is really sophisticated, and there's a lot of scholarship on it by Christopher Cullen and Charlotte Firth, and a book on thinking with cases had just come out as well. And so we started to have a conversation. So that book came out in 2007. And she was just so amazed that there is such a rich tradition in China. And actually, she thought the scholarship on the history of the case record in China was more robust than it had been in Europe. And so she was working on that and really engaged with what was happening in the Chinese scholarship on the topic. And so we did a course on cross-cultural medical history. And then out of that course, she came up with a research topic to look at the specific book. It's published in 1682 called The Specimen, and look at it particularly point of view of the genre of recipes, because it's the first time that a recipe had been translated from Chinese into Latin. And she was interested in epistemic genres, distinct from literary genres. So instead of genres that are about meaning or expression or entertainment, like we would say fiction or plays and poems, she was writing about genres that are about knowledge. They're knowledge-producing genres. So she calls them epistemic genres. And recipes, like medical cases, are epistemic genres. And what she found really interesting is that these are completely commensable forms, narrative forms, that cross cultures. So China had medical cases, and they also had recipes, as did Europe. And what we see here, when we look at the translations, the reason why we focus on the recipe is that if we abstract up a level and look at a commensable narrative form, in this case a recipe, we can see it like a ship carrying knowledge across cultures. It's recognizable. There's contents in the ship that aren't easy to translate, right, necessarily. Some get translated, some aren't, but that genre is completely commensable. And so then we could unpack how, what different interesting issues about translation, like what terms get Latinized. Well, they happen to be drugs that that were in the markets at the time, like China root or ginseng and ginger. So very beginning of Latinizing terms, making one-to-one correspondence of plants, the medicinals. And other things are left in the Romanization, are transliterated. They're not translated. Oh, measurement was also easy to do a one-to-one translation. They're commensurable. They could find Roman, equivalents to the units that were used in the Chinese recipe. And then the titles themselves, however, were left in transliteration, even though contents of the titles were easily translatable into Latin because they're numbers, So why didn't they choose to make a complete Latin translation of the formula titles? So that was another problem. And we said, well, understanding the sound of the formula's names could be useful in the markets in Goa or, in Macau at the time for the Jesuits or people reading the book. So I think that's one argument we made. So that is an ongoing project. We looked then at the next thing that we published was a chapter that came out in a book that Harold Cook edited about the translation of Chinese medical texts into Europe and also within East Asia, Translations at Work. And what we've decided to do is, instead of taking a synchronic approach, like let's just look at one text at one time and understand it, and the rest, one recipe actually, let's look at 3 translations over time, because the same Chinese text, which is a prose version, rhyme version of pulse-taking text, the Maijre, was first translated in 1313 in Persian in Rashal al-Din's translation kind of center. And in the Ilkhan Empire, they're in contact with the Yuan dynasty and the Mongol Empire. So that's 1313. They made certain choices. Then this 1618 translation into Latin, and then a 1730s translation into French. And what we found, if you abstract up a level, there are commensable distinctions in terms of narrative form. So we went from the recipe to distinctions of prose versus verse.
Right.
And also primary text versus commentary. Also visual information, illustrations, and captions for those, or explanations of those illustrations and tables. And in each case, looking diachronically over time, so not synchronically like our 2017 article, we saw that the translators made different choices. Right. About those, so the verse was honored in the Persian one, but not in the later Latin and French. They didn't care about versifying it anymore. The primary and commentary were collapsed in the Latin and completely separated in the French. And there are lots of illustrations in the first two, the Persian and the Latin one, but no illustrations from the original at all in the Enlightenment period translation in the French context, but not of the original text. But there was different notes. That was a kind of meta-analysis on the translation and the text that we don't see in the two previous ones. So,
do you attribute any reasons for this or these differences in the translations?
We make some, we do make some arguments, hypotheses about why these different translation choices were made. But the main method that we demonstrate is that we're not looking at whether or not they made an accurate one-to-one translation, the whole loss in translation argument. What we're doing is we're using a literary analysis to abstract up to the level of what's commensurable and what's incommensurable.
Right.
And so both of these articles are about what's commensurable. Like the narrative genre of recipes and cases are absolutely commensurable across these cultures. And these distinctions, prose, verse, commentary, primary text, illustrations, and text that are commenting on the illustrations are absolutely, it may seem really simplistic, but no one had actually done that work, you see? Mm. And we had a really good example where the Chinese text that they're translating, the genre of pulse rhyme texts, we have a good history of that on the Chinese side I could draw on. And we could make some, I think, really interesting points about the kinds of choices translators make at that higher level.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've done, and I'm sure you have as well, but I do a bit of translation myself, and it's you have to make a lot of decisions always, and what you lose, what you keep, and at the end of the day, there's a lot that's incommensurable. Like you say, I'm
right.
Sorry,
but both of these articles push it to the other direction. What is commensurable?
Yeah. Okay.
And instead of focusing on what's lost in translation and on incommensurability, like Shigehisa Kuriyama's brilliant book Expressiveness of the Body does, right? So we're not arguing against that. We're just going to the other side of the spectrum and saying, well, let's look at what things are commensurable. Mm. And what kind of choices people make within the realm of commensurability. And then you can start to look at things where, the translation broke down, or very interesting choices about how they translate things because of things that the receiving culture is interested in, like the circulation of blood at the time in the post-Harvey period. But I won't go into that right now. You'll have to read the article.
Okay. So they do. But in general, what is commensurable is dependent on the culture. So different cultures will have different things. They sort of that are more adaptable to that culture linguistically or for whatever reason, and that they will make different choices regarding that.
Yeah, I think translation's always an act of transformation.
Yeah,
always.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
And that transformation says more about the culture that's doing the translation than about the culture that they're receiving it from. But that's what we're trying to really unpack different ways of approaching it so that we can get beyond the incommensurability problem into a form of, I guess you could say, I'm moving toward medical bilingualism. I want people to understand the richness of the Chinese medical tradition from at least a historical perspective, and bring what I've learned to bear on our modern, engagements, which too often run into confrontation, differentiation, competition, rejection, rather than, cooperation, understanding, exchange.
Right.
But.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious why specifically it seems the Jesuits and the European, there's a lot of interest in the pulse studies from Chinese medicine and the circulatory system. Do you have any any understanding why that was? I mean, it does. I think it fascinates a lot of people involved in Chinese medicine, but that seemed to be, at least the article I read, a lot was based on pulse studies.
Right, because at that time, in the end of the 17th century, the Jesuit Michael Boehm really was translating what he considered to be a more complex system than what was available to the Europeans at the time.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And then by the 1730s, you've got the critique saying this is just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. But there are examples where they are engaging in understanding vitalism in a way that Chinese medicine can further their way of thinking. And there's a really wonderful article in the same book that I referenced by Cook, edited by Cook, on Montpellier and French vitalism and engaging with Chinese medical texts, which I would call a kind of hybridization, at least engagement, exchange. The Chinese medical ideas of the pulse and energy and stuff are used in a particular French context in very interesting ways. So if I know we don't want to go on too much, but I just want to emphasize before I lose this train of thought how much I've appreciated having this conversation with you. I think things have come together for me in a way that's different from how I thought of the collective, let's say, oeuvre that I've produced. Like, I wouldn't have thought to bring in my work with Jana Pomada on the issue of commensurability and incommensurability and medical bilingualism, or even thought to connect my frustration with my first acupuncture class when I was all of 16 as all being related. But you're right, they are. So thanks for bringing that level of understanding to my own obsessions in the past 40 years.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. It's fascinating to hear, because how people's personal lives overlap with their work, and it's often not a clear line. On that note, I'm quite curious what you're working on at the moment. I've heard a little bit that you're working on the idea of the hand in Chinese medicine, but I don't know much more than that. That's your current focus, as I understand it. Is that right?
That's right. I got very interested in the phenomenon of Chinese physicians using their hand to think with. Okay. So it's a phenomenon of hand mnemonics, and it's not just Chinese physicians; it's all across Chinese culture. It's a way of doing divinations. Was used in Buddhist and Taoist practices and rituals. So I decided to write my second book on how the Chinese physician or healers generally use their body as technology. Right. And I think that's really relevant today in the sense that the body of the practitioner was cultivated in a certain way to make their treatments more efficacious, but also they used their hands to of course take pulse, and they had to cultivate the sense of feeling and sensing and seeing, right, and hearing and being attuned to their patients. That's one way that I understand the cultivation of the healer and the way that the Chinese wrote about it themselves. But also they use their hands in a way that's cognitive, to facilitate cognitive processes, to make decisions. And that's really a different use of the hand than pulse taking. It's using the hand to remember complex concepts and the relationships to each other, to think with, to do calculations. Yeah. And so I'm writing a book that's called Grasping Heaven and Earth: The Healer's Body as Technology in Classical Chinese Medicine. And it's basically about evidence of the way the healer's body was cultivated to be an integral part of the efficaciousness of their treatments, but also how they use their bodies, and particularly their hands, to think with, to do as an extension of their minds. So I link it actually to cognitive science ideas of extended cognition.
Okay. That's really interesting. That's a really interesting idea. It's something that definitely resonates with me, and especially in the way I think it was something that was around in the West up until recent biomedical history. I mean, my uncles who are doctors complain that the younger doctors can't do anything without reliance on a machine. And I know that there's in the army that they find difficulty finding army surgeons because they require machines as a facilitation for various diagnostic procedures.
Right. Or how about just how physicians aren't engaging with their patients and looking at them and talking with them, but it's always with some software. They think that the software, the computer is a proxy for their own minds.
Yeah.
So I think that the book I'm writing about how the body itself was used to think with and to, make decisions with, and to, cultivating the body of the healer at a time in which things are just taken out of not just the healer's body, but their own minds.
Yeah.
They're deputizing their minds to computers.
Yeah.
And so I'm obviously, as you know, my work, I always engage in the present as well. My questions come out of my present, and I use history to talk about them, but I also engage as best I can with current public health issues related to East Asia, with my SARS article, with responding to Yo-Yo, with current piece on From Sick Man of Asia to Sick Uncle Sam. And so this book is a response to how I see, this is really problematic. Like people relying on their phones all the time for maps, and if there's no connection, they can't find their way in the streets anymore because they don't know how to read a map. Like, why are we deputizing our own minds to all these computers all the time?
Yeah.
So, and it's especially problematic when physicians are doing that at the cost of a relationship with their patients and actually cultivating their own ability to have conversations that would help them and also observe things that would help them better treat their patients.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is, it's a very narrow approach to medicine and a very an attachment just to the empirical side of it, and yeah, they sort of, a lot of physicians in those contexts, they let go of the wider spectrum, I think, of healing, and developing technology and skills in their own bodies. I really look forward to reading that. That'll be amazing.
I look forward to finishing it.
Oh, great! I bet. We'll have to have you back on the podcast when it's done.
I accept the invitation.
Excellent.
That would be great.
On that note, I think we might wrap up and leave it there, but I'd love to thank you for your time today.
And likewise to you, Daniel. It was as much a pleasure for me as I hope it was for you to have this exchange today.
It certainly was. Thanks a lot. Thanks again. I'd once again like to thank Marta for taking the time out to talk to us today on the podcast, and I'm hoping you all found this discussion as illuminating as I did. On that note, we'll leave it there. Bye for now.